It's amazing how something small, like a little local story, can suddenly send you down a rabbit hole of history.
Yeah, totally.
And that's exactly what happened to us recently when Mike Corson posted something interesting on Ashley County Now.
Oh, yeah.
It was about a piece of track, a section of railroad track, and it got us thinking about the whole story behind it.
Interesting.
And that led us to the Ashley, Drew, and Northern Railway.
Ah, the ADN, a classic. It's really amazing how these kind of smaller railroads, the ones you don't always hear about,
Right.
they often have such a huge impact on their communities. And they've got these rich histories.
Definitely.
So to dig into the ADN,
Okay.
we've got a couple of great sources.
Nice.
First, we've got this article from American-Rails.com.
Okay.
It's called Ashley, Drew, and Northern Railway, Serving Southern Forests.
Nice.
It gives us a really good overview of how the railroad operated and, the history behind it.
Perfect.
And then for those who really want to geek out on the details, we've got the HawkinsRails page on the ADN.
Nice. I love that site.
Yeah, they go deep on the locomotives and all the equipment they used over the years. So
Yeah.
it's a goldmine for our train fans out there.
For sure.
So what we want to do in this deep dive is basically unpack the whole story of the ADN.
Sounds good.
Pulled out the most interesting parts.
Yeah.
Look at how it shaped southeastern Arkansas.
Okay.
And hopefully we'll see what makes this railroad so fascinating, especially for those of us who,
Right.
love local history and trains, of course.
All right, let's get started. So where does this story of the ADN begin?
Well, it actually starts a little earlier, back in 1902, with the Crossett Railway.
Okay.
Now, this was just a 10-mile line
Okay.
owned by the Crossett Lumber Company.
Right.
And its main purpose was hauling logs
Makes sense.
from the forests to the lumber mill in Crossett.
Yeah, getting that raw material where it needed to go.
Exactly, the lifeline of the logging industry back then.
So this Crossett Railway, it started operations in 1905,
That's right.
but it wasn't independent for very long, was it?
No, not at all. In 1912, it was sold
Okay.
and reorganized as the Crossett, Monticello, and Northern Railroad.
Wow, that's a mouthful.
Yeah, the CMNN. And they had big plans. They wanted to extend the line north, like way north, to connect with the Missouri Pacific Railroad.
Oh, wow, that would have been a major connection.
It would have. It would have opened them up to the whole national rail network.
So what happened?
Well, they got as far as Fountain Hill,
Good.
about 19 and a half miles north, but then
Oh.
they hit some financial roadblocks, and that was it for the expansion, at least for a while.
So they made it halfway there.
Almost, yeah. But then things changed again.
Okay.
And that's when it became the Ashley, Drew, and Northern that we know and love.
So how did that happen?
Well, in August of 1912,
Okay.
the company was reorganized again with new owners this time,
Dude.
and they decided to rename it the Ashley, Drew, and Northern Railway, named after, you guessed it.
Ashley and Drew counties.
You got it. And this time, they were able to push through and complete the line all the way to Monticello,
Nice.
which gave them a total of 40.7 miles of track.
So from a tiny 10-mile line to a 40-mile railway, all in just a few years.
It's pretty impressive, right? And for the next 20 years, those 40.7 miles were crucial,
Yeah.
absolutely vital to the logging industry in that part of Arkansas.
It's really interesting how it all started with lumber, but then the ADN adapted as the economy around it changed.
Totally. And a big part of that was connecting with the bigger railroads.
Right, the interchanges.
Exactly. They hooked up with the Chicago, Rock Island, and Pacific, the Rock Island for short,
Okay.
at a place called Whitlow Junction.
Got it.
And then right there in Crossett,
Yeah.
they had an interchange with the Arkansas and Louisiana Missouri Railway,
Okay.
which itself connected to the Missouri Pacific and the Rock Island. So
Wow, so they were really well connected then.
they were, and that made them a key player in the whole rail network.
It's like they went from this isolated logging line to being part of this huge interconnected system.
It is. And as they became better connected, what they were carrying changed too.
Not just logs and lumber anymore.
Right. Things really started to shift in 1934 when the Crossett Chemical Company opened.
Yeah.
Suddenly, the ADN was hauling new types of freight.
Interesting.
But the big game changer, the thing that really diversified their cargo, was the arrival of the paper industry in Crossett.
Okay, I see where this is going.
In 1936, a big paper mill opens up, and then in 1945, you've got The Chase Paper Bag Company setting up shop.
Wow, so Crossett became a paper town.
Pretty much, and all of a sudden, the ADN is moving massive amounts of paper products, finished paper packaging, all that stuff.
It's amazing to think about, right? Like the same tracks that used to carry just rough logs are now transporting these finished products.
Exactly, and this really cemented Crossett as the heart of the ADN's operations.
Yeah, their main hub.
Absolutely. Most of their customers were in or around Crossett at that point.
Interesting. And as all this was happening, the way they transported logs was changing too, right?
You got it. As trucking became more common and more practical for those shorter hauls,
right,
the reliance on trains for moving logs actually decreased.
It's like each form of transportation finds its own niche,
Yeah, definitely. Rail for the long haul, the bulk goods, and trucks for the more local, adaptable stuff.
Okay, so we've got the cargo changing, and of course the technology was evolving as well.
Right.
Tell me about their switch from steam to diesel locomotives.
Well, like a lot of railroads,
Yes.
the ADN made that transition after 1950.
Okay.
Before that, their main workhorses were these 280 consolidation-type steam engines.
Okay.
They were known for their power, their pulling strength.
Yeah.
And the HawkinsRails page actually has some cool details about specific locomotives.
Oh, nice.
Like they had ADN #105 built by Baldwin in 1911.
Okay.
And #115, which was originally built for the St. Louis Iron Mountain and Southern Railway.
Wow, that's a cool history right there.
Right. And then there's #125, another Alco Brooks locomotive dating all the way back to 1901.
It's amazing to think of these engines chugging along all those years ago.
Yeah, they were the backbone of the ADN for decades.
And then came the diesel era.
It did. They started with smaller diesel-electric units,
Okay.
more versatile,
Right.
First, they got some General Electric 70 and 95 tonners.
Okay.
The American Rails article mentions the GE 70 tonners, numbered 170 to 172,
Right.
and the 95 tonner, #173, which arrived around 1950.
Okay.
And then later on, they added some electromotive division locomotives, EMDs.
I've heard of those.
Yeah, they got SW900s, SW1200s, and SW1500s.
So a nice mix of smaller diesels for their work.
Yeah, perfect for the rail yards and local freight runs.
It sounds like they were really efficient with their operations.
Yeah, they knew what they needed and got it.
No need for giant cross-country engines.
Exactly. But then a big change came in 1963.
Okay, what happened?
Georgia Pacific bought them, the whole thing.
Wow. Georgia Pacific, the big timber and paper company.
Yeah, they acquired the ADN and Crossett lumber in July of '63.
That's a huge shift.
Yeah.
So how did things change under new ownership?
Well, initially, the ADN kept doing what it was doing.
Okay.
They stayed profitable, still had a good mix of freight traffic.
Right.
Of course, wood products were still their main thing.
Makes sense.
But they were also moving more finished wood products now.
Why?
Plywood, for example, and a lot more pulpwood was going to the GP mills.
Okay, so GP kept things running smoothly at first.
They did. But over time, the picture started to change.
How so?
Well, through the 70s and 80s,
Yeah.
a lot of the ADN's customers who weren't in the wood and paper business,
Right.
they slowly stopped using the railway.
Interesting.
So by the 1990s, they were mainly just hauling pulpwood.
Okay, so their business really narrowed down.
It did, and the American Rails article points to a couple of key reasons why the ADN eventually shut down.
Oh, interesting. What were they?
Well, first, Georgia Pacific changed how they did things at their paper plant.
How so?
They switched from using short pieces of pulpwood to using whole tree-length logs.
Oh, wow. That's a big change.
It was, and that pretty much eliminated the need to transport pulpwood by rail.
Yeah, that would hurt.
It did. And on top of that, the railway itself had some built-in challenges.
Really?
It had some steep grades and some pretty tight curves.
Oh, I see.
And that made operating the trains more difficult and probably less cost-effective compared to other options.
It's kind of a classic story, isn't it?
Yeah,
Progress and efficiency can sometimes mean the end of an older way of doing things.
it's true. But even as they were facing these challenges,
Yeah.
the ADN had some loyal locomotives that kept running until the very end.
Oh, yeah. What were they?
They had SW900, 900, 907,
Okay.
a couple of CF7s, numbered 1513 and 1514,
Got it.
and their biggest engine, a GP28, #1812.
So those were the last ones standing.
They were. But with the declining freight and the operational hurdles, Georgia Pacific filed to abandon the entire route in August of '95.
Wow, the end of the line.
It was. And the Interstate Commerce Commission, the ICC, they approved it.
So that was it then. The ADN was done.
Well, not quite yet. They had one last run.
Oh, a final farewell.
You could say that. On June 29th, 1996, they took that GP28 #1812 and ran it along the entire line from Crossett to Monticello and back.
Wow, that's a fitting tribute, you know?
It is a real end of an era.
84 years of service.
Yep. But even though the ADN was officially gone, a small piece of it survived.
Right.
Yeah, the next day, they sold the section of track between Whitlow Junction and Crossett to another Georgia Pacific-owned railroad, the Fordyce and Princeton.
So a little part of the ADN lived on.
It did, serving the industrial area around Crossett.
That's cool.
And you know, the ADN was also done for their boxcars.
Oh, yeah, they were pretty distinctive.
They were. They had this big fleet of 50-foot boxcars, all painted in a really striking green and white scheme.
Yeah, I've seen pictures. Really nice.
Right. And they had the company logo, the pine tree on them.
Right.
And these cars, they traveled all over North America, not just locally.
Wow, so they were rolling ambassadors for the ADN.
You could say that. And here's the crazy part.
Yeah.
Some of them are still in service today.
No way. That's amazing.
It is. Like little pieces of ADN history still out there on the rails.
That's so cool.
And speaking of history, the HawkinsRails page has some interesting stories about the people behind the ADN, too.
Oh, yeah? Like who?
Well, they have an account from Russell Tedder, who became the president of the ADN and the Fordyce and Princeton back in '76.
Okay.
And he talks about how both these railroads started as what the ICC called tap lines.
Tap lines, what's that?
It basically means they were built and run as extensions of lumber company facilities.
Oh, I see.
Like the Crossett Lumber Company's operations.
So they were tied to the timber industry from the very beginning.
Exactly. And Tedder's time as president was a really busy time for the ADN. He says that in the late 70s, they were handling over 50,000 carloads of freight per year.
Whoa, that's a lot.
It is, especially for a relatively small railroad.
Yeah, it shows just how important they were to the local economy.
Definitely. And then, when the Rock Island shut down, the ADN had to deal with a lot more traffic.
No, how come?
Well, a lot of the freight that used to go to the Rock Island was now being routed through the Missouri Pacific line at Monticello.
I see.
So the ADN had to handle longer, heavier trains.
So what did they do?
They got a couple of rebuilt GP9s from the Paducah and Louisville shops.
Okay.
And they designated those as GP10s, numbered 1810 and 1811.
And there's that story about one of those GP10s breaking down, right?
Yeah, there is. Tedder talks about this one trip where one of the GP10s just died.
Oh, no.
Yeah, shortly after leaving Monticello with a huge train, like 90 cars.
Yikes.
And the other GP10 had to pull the whole thing, including the broken down engine, all the way back to Crossett.
Oh, man, that's a tough situation.
It was, especially because there were some uphill sections.
Yeah.
Tedder really praises the engineer, Newell Birchfield, who managed to control that single locomotive so well, keeping the wheels from slipping, even though they were going super slow.
Wow.
The whole trip, 41 miles, took over 3 hours.
That's crazy.
And they ran out of sand, which helps with traction, before they even got back to Crossett.
That just shows how much skill it takes to operate these trains, especially in tough situations.
It does. It's more than just driving, that's for sure.
For sure. Now, I got to ask about that green and white paint scheme.
Ah, yeah, the ADN's signature look.
It wasn't just a random choice, was it?
Nope, not at all. Tedder explains that when he became president, he wanted to give the locomotives a new look, something fresh.
Yeah.
So he spent a lot of time looking at pictures of different railroad paint schemes.
Wow, that's dedication.
And in the end, he based the ADN's design on the Gulf, Mobile, and Ohio Railroad.
The GM and
Yeah, and maybe a little bit of inspiration from the Richmond, Fredericksburg, and Potomac, too.
The RF&P.
Yeah, they had a similar kind of color combo.
Interesting.
And he actually worked with the paint shop engineers at Paducah to get the exact shades of green and white just right.
So it was a really thoughtful process.
It was very deliberate. He wanted it to look just right.
And it did. It really stood out.
It did. And they didn't stop with the paint.
What else did they change?
Well, Tedder also brought in a new numbering system for the locomotives.
Oh, interesting.
It was based on horsepower and when they acquired them.
So one more logical system.
Exactly. Like the old 70-ton GEs, they became the 600 series.
Okay.
And the EMD switchers started with 1200 and 900.
Right.
The newer GP10s were 1810 and 1811 and so on.
Makes sense.
It just made it easier to track and manage the whole fleet.
And I was surprised to learn that the ADN actually had a lot of freight cars for such a small railroad.
Yeah, it's pretty wild.
Over 2,000 at one point.
That's what the HawkinsRails page says.
That's a huge number for a railroad that was only about 40 miles long.
It is. It just shows you how much freight they were moving, especially in their heyday.
Absolutely. Now, the page also mentions a few places along the line, like Valley Junction and Whitlow Junction.
Ah, yes.
What was the significance of those spots?
Well, Valley Junction was where the ADN crossed the Wilmar and Saline Valley Railroad.
Okay.
Back in the early days when both lines were mostly focused on logging. And Whitlow Junction, as we talked about.
Right.
That was the crucial connection to the Rock Island.
Yeah.
So those places were really important for linking the ADN to the rest of the rail network.
It's all about those connections.
It is, for sure. And within Crossett itself,
the
ADN was running pretty much around the clock.
Oh, wow.
Serving those paper mills and all the other industries.
Keeping things moving.
Exactly. Tedder describes a 24-hour switching operation.
Wow.
With 6 regular switch engine crews working in shifts.
Busy place.
It was. And the first switcher on the day shift had a specific job. They called it the paper route.
Interesting.
Its main task was to deliver empty boxcars to the 3 main paper mills.
Okay.
And then pick up the loaded ones.
So they were constantly going back and forth.
Yep. And they'd bring in extra crews during busy periods.
It just shows how essential the ADN was to those industries.
It does, keeping everything running smoothly.
It's fascinating to imagine all that activity happening, you know?
Yeah, it was a real hub of industry.
Oh, and then there's that mention of the Venice line.
Right. That was another interesting part of the ADN's history.
So what was that all about?
The Venice line was originally built by the Crossett Lumber Company.
Okay.
It ran south from their main mill complex to Venice, Louisiana, where it connected to the Missouri Pacific.
Got it.
And they mainly used it for log trains.
Makes sense.
Bringing logs in from their various logging camps.
So even when large-scale railroad logging died down in the 50s.
Right. They kept a part of the Venice line within the Crossett industrial area.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, and they still called it the Venice line.
So another link to their logging past.
It is. And of course, a railroad needs a place to keep its locomotives in good shape.
The shops?
Exactly. The HawkinsRails page has some photos of the ADN's locomotive shops.
Oh, cool.
They were right there in Crossett.
Okay.
And that's where they did all the maintenance and repairs.
Back in the steam days, and then for the diesels, too.
Yep. Keeping those engines running smoothly was crucial.
It's amazing how much we've learned about this railroad.
It is, isn't it?
So to wrap things up, what are the key takeaways from our deep dive into the Ashley, Drew, and Northern?
Well, I think the biggest thing is that the ADN played a huge role in the development of southeastern Arkansas.
Yeah.
Especially those key industries, timber and paper.
Right.
And it's remarkable how they evolved.
Yeah.
Starting as a simple logging line, and then becoming this vital freight carrier, adapting to new technology, diversifying their cargo.
They really rolled with the punches.
They did. And what's really striking to me is just how much history is packed into this seemingly small railroad.
Right. It's more than you'd expect.
It is. We've covered so much, from expansions and name changes to corporate takeovers, the shift to diesel, that cool paint scheme.
Yeah.
Even that story about the engineer who kept that train going despite a major breakdown.
Noel Birchfield, a real pro.
Absolutely. It's a richer story than you might think at first glance.
It is. And, you know, when we think about the ADN's rise and fall, it makes you wonder, what other things in our own communities have played similar roles, but we've forgotten about them?
That's a good point.
Maybe it's an old road, a bridge, a factory that's long gone.
It makes you want to look closer at your surroundings.
Yeah.
And think about the history behind the things we see every day, the things we might take for granted.
Absolutely. There are hidden stories everywhere if you know where to look.
That's for sure.
Well, on that note, thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the Ashley, Drew, and Northern Railway.
It was my pleasure.
Until next time, keep exploring.
And keep those wheels turning.
We'll see you soon.
Take care.